What happens when the doors stop opening and no one tells you why? Not a slammed door, not a public rejection, just silence. Quiet, polite, unmistakable silence. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine planning a triumphant international tour. Flights penciled in, outfits imagined, talking points rehearsed, headlines pre-written in your mind. And then, one by one, the confirmations don't come. Emails go unanswered. Calls are returned with vague delays. We'll circle back. Let us check availability. We'll be in touch. And then they're not. This is not a story about a canceled trip. This is a story about what happens when reputation collides with reality, when expectation meets resistance, when influence is tested not by applause, but by absence. And according to reports and insider confirmations, that collision reached a breaking point when Archewell CEO quietly confirmed what many suspected but few dared to say out loud. The Australian tour was off. Not postponed, not reworked, axed. And if the reports are accurate, Meghan Markle did not take that news quietly. But before we get there, you need to understand why this tour mattered so much. Why Australia was not just another stop on a map. And why the reaction behind closed doors was allegedly far more intense than anything the public ever saw. Because this wasn't just a scheduling issue. This was personal. Let's rewind. For years, Meghan Markle has existed in a strange, in-between space. No longer a working royal. Not fully detached from royal identity either. A global figure whose name still commands attention, but whose power increasingly depends on perception rather than position. And perception, as you know, is fragile. The Australian tour was meant to be a reset, a relaunch, a statement. According to those familiar with the planning, it wasn't framed internally as a casual visit. It was positioned as a moment, a chance to reclaim narrative ground, to demonstrate international relevance, to show that doors were still open, that prestige still followed. Australia, of all places, was supposed to be friendly territory. Why? Because history said so. Years earlier, royal tours to Australia were marked by enormous crowds, warm media coverage, and a sense of shared pageantry. Australia understands royal symbolism. It understands celebrity. It understands spectacle. And for a long time, the assumption was that goodwill lingered. But assumptions can be dangerous, especially when the world has changed, the audience has shifted, and patience has worn thin. Behind the scenes, the tour was said to involve high-end accommodations, carefully selected dining venues, and controlled public-facing engagements. Nothing left to chance. Everything curated. Everything aligned with brand Sussex. Polished, purposeful, humanitarian adjacent. At least, that was the plan. Here's where things reportedly began to unravel. In the luxury hospitality world, responses are rarely dramatic. There are no angry refusals, no press releases, just availability or lack of it. And according to multiple accounts, availability became a recurring issue. Not just once, not just twice, repeatedly. Hotels that typically accommodate high-profile guests were suddenly fully booked. Restaurants that pride themselves on exclusivity were unable to accommodate private arrangements. Venues that had hosted celebrities, politicians, and royalty before were suddenly reassessing schedules. Individually, each explanation sounded reasonable. Collectively, they told a different story, and that story was silence. Now, here's an important distinction. No one, publicly at least, stood up and said, "We don't want them here." That's not how this world works. Reputation isn't managed through confrontation. It's managed through distance. And distance, in this case, was reportedly everywhere. Inside Archewell, this didn't immediately trigger alarm bells. At first, it was treated as a logistical hiccup. Australia is busy. Schedules change. High-end spaces fill up. These things happen. But then the pattern became harder to ignore. When multiple categories of partners begin responding the same way, professionals notice. And when professionals notice, urgency follows. This is where the stakes started to rise. Because Archewell isn't just a charity. It's a brand vehicle. It carries reputational weight. Every public appearance, every partnership, every trip is meant to reinforce legitimacy. And legitimacy depends on acceptance by institutions that don't need you, but choose you. Or don't. According to those familiar with the situation, internal discussions began to shift tone. Less optimism. More concern. More calls, more pressure to find solutions. And underlying it all, a growing anxiety that the issue wasn't scheduling at all. It was sentiment, public sentiment, corporate sentiment, cultural mood. And here's the uncomfortable truth many insiders point to. Australia didn't erupt in outrage. It didn't protest. It didn't mock loudly. It simply disengaged. No frenzy, no excitement, no urgency to participate, which, in many ways, is worse. For a figure whose influence depends on attention, indifference is devastating. And this is where emotion reportedly entered the room. Because according to insiders, Meghan did not see this tour as optional. It was symbolic. It was proof of continued relevance. Proof that she could still command international interest without royal infrastructure. So when resistance emerged, the response was not passive acceptance. It was frustration. Sources describe mounting irritation with gatekeepers, with intermediaries, with the idea that access could be restricted quietly, without explanation. Because for someone accustomed to high visibility, quiet rejection feels like disrespect. And disrespect, as many close observers have noted over the years, is not something Meghan tolerates easily. Now, let's be careful here. No one is claiming a public meltdown. No screaming press conference. No dramatic walkout. This was all reportedly internal, private, controlled. But that doesn't mean it wasn't intense. Emails were allegedly sharper. Conversations more strained. The language, according to those briefed on it, shifted from hopeful to accusatory. From "how do we fix this?" to "why is this happening?" And perhaps the most revealing part wasn't the emotion itself. It was the disbelief. Because embedded in that reaction was an assumption that still lingers, that status guarantees access. That global recognition automatically translates to hospitality eagerness. That name alone opens doors. But the world doesn't work that way anymore. Especially not in industries obsessed with optics, controversy avoidance, and brand safety. Luxury hotels don't chase attention. They curate it. High-end restaurants don't need famous diners. They need predictable environments. And public-facing venues don't want narratives they can't control. And that's where things became complicated. Because Meghan Markle, fairly or unfairly, has become unpredictable in the eyes of many institutions. Polarizing, emotionally charged, surrounded by media narratives that can shift overnight. From a risk perspective, that matters. So when Archewell CEO reportedly confirmed that the Australian tour was being cancelled, the explanation was careful, diplomatic, sanitized. Words like logistical challenges and scheduling conflicts were used. But those close to the situation knew better. This wasn't about calendars. This was about doors that never opened. And according to multiple reports, that confirmation landed hard. Because once the CEO said it out loud, there was no reframing it internally. No spinning it as a pause. No pretending momentum was building. The moment marked something deeper, a realization that influence was being tested, and the results were not what had been expected. And here's where the story turns. Because insiders say that once the tour was officially axed, the emotional response intensified. Not just disappointment. Something sharper. Something closer to anger. Anger at institutions. Anger at advisors. Anger at a world that no longer seemed eager to accommodate. But the most unsettling part? The anger wasn't just about Australia. It was about what Australia represented. A canary in the coal mine. Because if Australia, a country once considered welcoming and familiar, was quietly pulling away, what did that say about everywhere else? And that question, according to those close to the situation, sparked a chain reaction that would ripple far beyond one canceled trip. But what came next wasn't just frustration. It was a reckoning. And that reckoning, as we're about to see, would expose a pattern no amount of PR could fully hide. This tour was never meant to be quiet. It was never meant to slip under the radar. It wasn't designed as a casual visit or a low-key humanitarian stopover. According to people familiar with the planning, this was supposed to be the moment, the re-entry, the proof-of-life tour for a brand that many quietly wondered was losing oxygen. So let me ask you something right at the start. When a public figure plans a major international tour, what are they really trying to prove? Visibility? Relevance? Power? Or reassurance? Reassurance that they still matter. From the very beginning, the Australian tour carried an almost emotional weight inside Archewell. This wasn't just another itinerary. It was framed internally as a strategic reset, a way to remind the world that Meghan Markle could still command international attention without the backing of royal machinery. No palisades, no royal calendar, no crown, just her. And that, in many ways, was the point. Australia wasn't chosen randomly. It was selected deliberately, symbolically, strategically. In the minds of those planning the trip, Australia represented familiarity, warmth, a place where royal tours had historically been embraced, a country that understood pageantry and prestige, but also liked to think of itself as relaxed and fair-minded. The logic was simple. If a tour could succeed anywhere, it would succeed there. That assumption would soon be tested. But early on, optimism ruled the room. Planning documents, according to insiders, outlined a tightly controlled schedule, select public appearances, carefully framed charitable engagements, opportunities for flattering press coverage, everything designed to show momentum, everything designed to suggest that this was not a figure retreating from the global stage, but one reclaiming it. There was talk of high-end accommodations, not just comfort, but signaling. Where you stay matters. It sends a message. Luxury hotels don't just provide beds, they provide legitimacy. When a five-star property hosts you, it communicates acceptance. The same logic applied to restaurants. Private dining, discretion, visibility without chaos. The kind of places that quietly host billionaires and heads of state without ever confirming it publicly. This wasn't about indulgence. It was about optics. At least, that's how it was framed. And for a while, everything seemed possible. Initial outreach went out. Calendars were checked. Assistants exchanged pleasantries. There was no outright rejection, no warning signs, just the usual polite back and forth that precedes any high-profile visit. But then something subtle happened. The tempo slowed. Responses took longer. Confirmations stayed tentative. Language shifted from enthusiasm to neutrality. Words like delighted and honored quietly disappeared, replaced by phrases like "we'll review" and "we'll get back to you." Now, if you've ever worked in public relations or event planning, you know this feeling. That moment when nothing is wrong, but nothing is right either. At first, the delays were brushed off. Australia is busy. Tourism seasons fluctuate. Big cities fill up quickly. No reason to panic. But then the same pattern repeated, and repeated, and repeated again. Multiple hotels. Multiple restaurants. Different cities. Same outcome. Availability issues. That phrase became a recurring character in this story. It's worth pausing here, because this is where reality starts to creep in. In the hospitality world, especially at the top tier, availability is rarely just about space. It's about willingness. It's about fit. It's about whether the guest enhances the brand or complicates it. And according to multiple accounts, complicate was the unspoken concern. This wasn't a matter of one venue being cautious. It was a broader hesitation, a quiet calculation happening behind closed doors. Risk assessment, media fallout projections, the cost of association versus the benefit of prestige. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Hosting Meghan Markle doesn't just bring attention. It brings narrative, scrutiny, headlines that the venue does not control. Some brands love that. Others run from it. And increasingly, the latter seem to be winning. Inside Archewell, the mood began to shift. The tour team reportedly moved from confidence to contingency planning. Alternate hotels were suggested. Secondary venues explored. Schedules adjusted. But each adjustment felt like a concession. And concessions, especially unacknowledged ones, sting. For Meghan, this tour was not just logistical. It was personal. It was a referendum on how the world still viewed her, on whether the post-royal rebrand had landed or whether it was quietly stalling. And when you're invested at that level, every delay feels like a judgment. Sources describe growing frustration. Questions began to surface. Why is this taking so long? Why are we being treated like this? Why is access suddenly conditional? Those questions didn't exist in a vacuum. They were layered on top of years of perceived slights, criticisms, and battles with media narratives. This wasn't just about Australia. It was about history. And history, for Meghan, is never far from the present. What makes this chapter especially revealing is that, at this point, no one had said no. Not explicitly. There were no rejection emails. No official statements. Just a slow accumulation of non-answers. And psychologically, That's far more destabilizing than a direct refusal, because a no can be challenged. Silence cannot. As the weeks passed, the internal narrative shifted again. According to insiders, some advisors began to quietly acknowledge what others resisted admitting. This wasn't bad luck. It was sentiment. Australia wasn't hostile. It was uninterested. And that realization landed heavily. Because indifference is the one thing a public figure cannot fight. You can counter criticism. You can reframe controversy. You can even spin scandal. But you cannot spin apathy. And yet, outwardly, optimism was maintained. The public was not meant to see uncertainty. Everything remained tentative but hopeful. No announcements were made. No expectations set. Privately, however, pressure was building. The tour had become a test. And the longer it dragged on, the more the silence spoke. Then came the moment that insiders describe as the beginning of the end. One particular hotel, a flagship property, the kind of place that, in previous years, would have been unthinkable to decline a high-profile guest. The response came back late. Polite, professional, unavailable. That was when the room reportedly went quiet. Because this wasn't just another venue. This was a bellwether, a signal. If this door wasn't opening, others wouldn't either. And suddenly, the question was no longer how to make the tour work. It was whether it could work at all. The Archewell team faced an uncomfortable decision. Push harder and risk public rejection, or pull back quietly and control the narrative. And behind that decision loomed a more personal tension. How to communicate this reality to someone who had built expectations around success. Because disappointment is one thing, but perceived rejection is another entirely. And according to those close to the situation, the conversation that followed was tense, emotional, charged, not explosive, but heavy with implication. This tour, which was supposed to demonstrate momentum, was now exposing vulnerability. And once that vulnerability is seen, it can't be unseen. But here's the twist. Even at this point, cancellation wasn't inevitable. Not yet. There was still a belief that something could change. That one yes could trigger others. That momentum could be manufactured. That belief would not survive what happened next. Because just when the team thought they'd hit the lowest point, another message arrived. And this one made it clear that the problem wasn't availability at all. It was appetite. And that realization would force a decision that no one wanted to make. But what came next would shift this story from quiet concern to outright crisis. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. Have you ever watched your phone light up and then go dark? 1 minute, the screen promises connection. The next, nothing. No reply. No explanation. Just that tiny, brutal indicator that your message was seen and set aside. Now imagine that feeling scaled up. Not one unanswered message, but dozens. Not casual texts, but carefully worded professional outreach sent by experienced teams who know how this world works. That's where this chapter begins. Because if Chapter 1 was about optimism meeting resistance, this chapter is about something far more unsettling. The slow realization that the resistance wasn't accidental. It was intentional. At first, everything looked normal. Requests went out through proper channels. Courtesy emails, scheduling inquiries, polished language. The kind of communication designed to make saying yes easy. And initially, the replies came back. Friendly, neutral, non-committal. We're reviewing availability. Let us confirm internally. We'll circle back shortly. Nothing alarming, nothing definitive. But then the tone shifted. The same emails were followed up on, and followed up again. The language became more cautious, more distant, shorter, less warm, and in some cases, there was no reply at all. This is the point where people unfamiliar with PR might think, so what? People get busy. But in this world, silence is communication, especially when it's selective. Because here's what insiders noticed almost immediately. Other high-profile requests were still being answered. Events continued. Celebrities still visited. Politicians still booked. The system was functioning. Just not for this tour. That's when unease crept in. The Archewell team reportedly began tracking responses. Not obsessively, but deliberately. Which venues replied? Which didn't? How long it took? What language was used? Patterns emerged. Luxury hotels that had previously accommodated controversial figures without hesitation were suddenly unavailable. Restaurants known for discretion were unwilling to commit to private dining arrangements. Event spaces that had hosted polarizing personalities in the past were suddenly cautious. And no one was saying why. That's the part that reportedly drove frustration to a new level. Because when someone tells you no, you can respond. You can negotiate. You can adjust. But when no one tells you anything, you're left filling in the blanks. And humans are very good at filling in blanks with fear. Inside planning calls, questions began to surface. Is this about security? Is it about cost? Is it about media backlash? Is this political? Or is it us? That last question hung in the air longer than anyone wanted. Because acknowledging that possibility meant confronting something far more uncomfortable than a scheduling conflict. It meant confronting reputation. And reputation is not controlled by press releases. It's controlled by consensus. One insider described this phase as professional ghosting. Not rude, not overt, just a collective step back. A quiet refusal to engage. Think about that. No scandals. No public outrage. No protests. Just a decision, made independently by multiple businesses, to opt out. That's powerful, and deeply unsettling for anyone used to commanding attention. As the days passed, the silence became harder to rationalize. Follow-ups went unanswered. Voicemails weren't returned. Assistants politely deflected. At one point, according to sources, a venue responded not with a yes or a no, but with a request for additional details that had already been provided. A classic delay tactic. That's when the tone inside Archewell reportedly sharpened. Because delay is one thing, avoidance is another. There's an unspoken hierarchy in the hospitality world, and when you're on the wrong side of it, you feel it immediately. You are no longer being courted. You are being assessed. An assessment, in this case, wasn't trending favorably. Let's pause and ask a hard question. Why would high-end hotels and restaurants, whose business model thrives on exclusivity and celebrity association, hesitate? The answer lies in risk. Risk to staff. Risk to other guests. Risk to brand identity. Risk of becoming a headline for reasons they cannot control. Meghan Markle, whether supporters like it or not, has become a lightning rod. Every appearance generates commentary. Every move is dissected. Every interaction is framed as symbolic. For some venues, that's publicity. For others, it's a liability. And increasingly, liability was winning. What made this especially painful was the contrast to expectations. The assumption had been that prestige would smooth the way. That prior royal association still carried weight. But here's the contradiction that insiders began to whisper about. Royal proximity without royal structure doesn't function the same way. When you're part of an institution, venues accommodate the institution. When you're outside it, you're assessed as an individual brand. And individual brands can be declined. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. As the silence stretched on, Meghan reportedly became more aware of the pattern. And that awareness, according to sources, did not produce resignation. It produced irritation. Because from her perspective, this wasn't just business. It was disrespect. Why wouldn't places want this attention? Why wouldn't they see the value? Why wouldn't they understand the opportunity? Those questions, insiders say, came up repeatedly. And when advisors attempted to explain the risk calculus, the explanations reportedly didn't land well. Because explanation implies acceptance, and acceptance implies powerlessness. This is where emotion entered the operational process, where planning became personal, where decisions were no longer just about logistics, but about perceived slights. Some insiders describe a growing sense of grievance, not outwardly expressed, but internally felt. A belief that Meghan was being unfairly treated, that she was being punished for narratives she didn't control. That belief intensified reactions to silence. Every non-response became a symbol. Every delay felt intentional. Every vague reply felt dismissive. And then came the moment that insiders describe as the tipping point of this chapter. A restaurant. High profile. Internationally recognized. The kind of place that prides itself on hosting powerful figures discreetly. After weeks of polite back and forth, they finally responded. The message was short. They were unable to accommodate. No reason given. No alternative offered. No follow-up. Just a professional no. And that, according to those familiar with the reaction, hit harder than any silence. Because now there was confirmation. Not speculation. Not interpretation. Confirmation. Someone had looked at the request and decided it wasn't worth the risk. That realization reportedly sparked a wave of internal reassessment. Advisors began urging caution, suggesting that pushing forward might lead to visible rejection, that forcing venues to say no publicly would be far worse than a quiet cancellation. This was no longer about making the tour work. It was about damage control. But here's where the emotional contradiction deepened. Pulling back felt like surrender. Canceling felt like admitting defeat. And for someone whose public narrative is built around resilience and perseverance, that was a hard pill to swallow. The silence wasn't just inconvenient anymore. It was humiliating. Because silence implies choice. It implies that others are choosing not to engage. And that choice is not something you can spin away. By this point, according to insiders, Meghan's frustration was no longer confined to logistics. It had become philosophical. What does it mean if the world doesn't want you the way it used to? What does it mean if prestige has an expiration date? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what does it mean if the doors you expected to open automatically now require persuasion? These are not questions a public figure wants to confront. And yet, they were unavoidable. Behind closed doors, the Archewell team began discussing worst-case scenarios. Quiet cancellation, reframing, minimizing exposure. And looming over all of it was a realization that no amount of outreach could manufacture enthusiasm where none existed. You cannot force desire. You cannot email your way into relevance. And that's when the red carpets of expectation were replaced by the cold glow of read receipts. Seen, but not answered. This chapter ends not with a decision, but with a feeling, a sense that something fundamental had shifted, that the rules had changed. And the most dangerous part? Once you notice that shift, you start seeing it everywhere. Because as the team would soon discover, Australia wasn't an isolated case. It was a signal. And what that signal revealed would make the silence of this chapter feel gentle by comparison. But what came next would finally strip away the illusion that this was just bad timing. And when that happened, everything changed. Chapter 2 complete. Say go when you're ready for Chapter 3. Go. Chapter 3, Australia's mood shift. What changed since the royal years? Here's the uncomfortable question no one wanted to ask out loud. What if Australia hadn't turned hostile, but had simply moved on? Not angry, not offended, not outraged, just done. That realization, according to people familiar with the situation, was far more unsettling than any protest or backlash could have been. Because anger means engagement. Anger means attention. Anger means you still matter. Indifference means you don't. And this chapter is where that truth began to sink in. For years, Australia had been treated as friendly ground, a reliable audience, a place that understood royalty, celebrity, and ceremony. Past royal tours had drawn massive crowds, streets lined with people, media coverage that was largely warm, even enthusiastic. Those memories loomed large in the minds of planners. But memories can be misleading. Because the Australia of today is not the Australia of 10 years ago. Not politically, not culturally, not emotionally. And that shift, subtle but significant, was something the tour planners underestimated. Australia's relationship with celebrity has changed. There's a growing skepticism toward perceived privilege, toward grievance narratives from wealthy public figures, toward moral lectures delivered from positions of extraordinary comfort. That doesn't mean Australians are cruel. Quite the opposite. It means they're pragmatic. They value authenticity. They value understatement. And increasingly, they resist spectacle that feels performative. Which raises an important question. How does a carefully curated, highly managed brand land in a culture that prizes bluntness and emotional restraint? Not easily. According to Australian media analysts, there's been a noticeable fatigue with imported celebrity drama. Audiences have grown wary of being used as backdrops for personal branding exercises, especially when those exercises are framed as altruism but feel self-serving. That context matters. Because when Archewell outreach hit Australian institutions, it didn't land in a vacuum. It landed in a media ecosystem already saturated with coverage of Meghan and Harry. Interviews, documentaries, podcasts, op-eds, counter-op eds. Australians knew the story. They'd heard it, and many felt they'd heard it enough. This is where the contrast with past royal tours becomes revealing. When working royals visit, they represent continuity, tradition, service. They don't sell themselves. They don't pitch narratives. They don't ask audiences to choose sides. They show up. They wave. They leave. That simplicity matters. By contrast, Meghan's public identity has become inseparable from storytelling, from framing, from interpretation. Every appearance carries subtext. Every speech is analyzed for messaging. And for institutions that want quiet, predictable operations, that's exhausting. So when Australians didn't rush to embrace the tour, it wasn't because they were angry. It was because they were tired. Tired of the noise. Tired of the drama. Tired of being positioned as characters in someone else's story. This sentiment didn't erupt overnight. It had been building quietly for years. And now, it was manifesting not in protests, but in apathy. No groundswell of excitement. No social media buzz. No sense of anticipation. And for a tour dependent on momentum, that absence was fatal. Inside Archewell, this cultural shift reportedly came as a shock. There had been an assumption that goodwill still existed. That past affection would translate forward. But goodwill is not permanent. It decays when it's not nurtured. It erodes when it's taken for granted. And perhaps most critically, it evaporates when people feel talked at instead of talked with. One Australian commentator summed it up bluntly: people aren't angry. They're bored. That word stings. Because boredom is unforgiving. You can't argue with it. You can't shame it away. You can't accuse it of bias. Boredom simply walks past you. And that's exactly what seemed to be happening. Local media coverage of the rumored tour was minimal. When it did appear, it was cautious, analytical, sometimes skeptical, rarely enthusiastic. Headlines weren't celebratory. They were questioning. Why now? What's the purpose? What's being asked of us? Those questions didn't signal hostility. They signaled distance. And distance, as we've seen, was becoming the defining theme of this story. For Meghan, this shift was particularly difficult to process because it challenged a core belief that public sympathy still leaned in her favor. In many markets, that might have been true once, but Australia had quietly recalibrated. And here's where the irony deepens. Australia has historically been critical of the monarchy. Republican sentiment runs strong. Skepticism toward inherited privilege is baked into the culture. And yet, working royals were often received warmly. Why? Because they showed restraint. Because they didn't complain publicly. Because they embodied duty rather than grievance. Meghan's narrative, by contrast, has centered on personal experience, on emotional truth, on perceived injustice. That resonates deeply in some cultures. In Australia, it lands differently. There's a saying often attributed to Australians: don't make a fuss. And by many accounts, the Sussex narrative has felt like one long fuss. This isn't about right or wrong. It's about cultural fit. And cultural fit determines reception. As this realization began to surface internally, the mood reportedly darkened. The problem wasn't logistics. It wasn't scheduling. It wasn't security. It was resonance. Or rather, the lack of it. And when resonance is missing, no amount of planning can create it. Some advisors reportedly suggested reframing the tour, making it smaller, less formal, less visible. But that solution came with its own problem. A smaller tour would look like a retreat. And retreat was the one thing this tour was never meant to be. So the tension deepened. Push forward and risk visible indifference. Pull back and confirm irrelevance. Neither option felt acceptable. This is where Meghan's emotional investment became more apparent. According to insiders, she struggled with the idea that Australia simply wasn't interested. Not angry, not rejecting, just uninterested. Because that explanation doesn't offer an enemy. It doesn't offer a villain. It doesn't offer injustice. It offers reality. And reality can't be challenged. By this point, frustration had reportedly shifted inward. Advisors felt pressure. The Archewell team felt scrutinized. The CEO, tasked with translating this mess into a coherent strategy, faced an impossible task. How do you explain cultural indifference to someone who believes they are still misunderstood rather than overexposed? How do you say, gently, that the audience might be done listening? Those conversations, by all accounts, were strained. And then came the realization that made everything worse. Australia wasn't an outlier. Early signals from other regions suggested similar fatigue, similar caution, similar reluctance to engage, which meant the problem wasn't local. It was global. And if that was true, then the Australian tour wasn't just a failed plan. It was a warning that the post-royal rebrand had hit a ceiling. And ceilings are terrifying things for public figures because they imply limits. Limits on influence, limits on attention, limits on control. And control, as many observers have noted, is central to Meghan's approach to public life. This chapter closes on that realization, not with a bang, with a quiet, devastating truth. Australia hadn't turned against Meghan Markle. It had simply stopped waiting for her. And once a culture stops waiting, no announcement can bring that anticipation back. But the real fallout was still ahead. Because this cultural shift didn't just change public mood. It triggered something far more volatile behind closed doors. And according to insiders, that internal reaction would soon spill over into a crisis that no one could contain. But what came next wasn't about Australia at all. It was about Archewell and the emergency conversations that would redefine everything. Imagine a room filled with people who have been trained to handle chaos, who have managed crises ranging from public relations nightmares to media storms. Now imagine that even they are quietly panicking. That's where the story moves next. Inside the walls of Archewell, where the cancellation of the Australian tour was beginning to feel very real. The moment the silence from Australia became impossible to ignore, the atmosphere reportedly shifted. What had begun as polite follow-ups and careful negotiations morphed into a series of high-stakes internal meetings. Emergency calls, strategy huddles, rapid-fire emails, all trying to answer one impossible question. How do we fix a problem that may have no fix? The urgency was palpable, according to sources. Meetings began earlier. Calls lasted longer. Advisors, typically measured and strategic, started exhibiting signs of frustration. Notes were passed back and forth. Brainstorms erupted over trivial details, as if perfecting the schedule could compensate for absent enthusiasm. Staff reportedly worked around the clock, trying to secure even a single venue, any sign of affirmation, any opening that could save the tour. And yet, the responses remained the same. Delays, deflections, indifference. Every positive thread pulled at the tapestry of hope, only to unravel. The silence, now amplified by repeated rejections, began to feel intentional, a collective, quiet message that the plan might not be welcome. It's important to note here that these weren't loud, aggressive confrontations. Insiders emphasized that these emergency calls were tense but controlled. The conversations were punctuated by professional courtesy, careful phrasing, and diplomacy. But the emotional undertone, stress, disbelief, frustration, was unmistakable. People who spend their careers maintaining calm were suddenly operating on edge. And what made the situation worse was the emotional stakes. This wasn't just a logistical problem for Archewell. According to insiders, it was deeply personal for Meghan Markle. She had invested years, both emotionally and strategically, into her post-royal brand. Every public appearance was meticulously designed to reinforce legitimacy, influence, and narrative control. Australia was not just another stop. It was supposed to be a statement. And statements require an audience. When the audience withdrew quietly, the message hit harder than any overt rejection could have. Every unanswered email, every politely declined invitation, every delayed response chipped away at the carefully constructed plan. According to sources, the realization that the tour might be in jeopardy sparked a flurry of internal speculation. Staff asked themselves, is this about public sentiment? Media fatigue? Is it a reaction to prior controversies? Or is it simply a reflection of how the world now perceives Meghan Markle herself? The answers, insiders suggest, were not comforting. As the days passed, the calls reportedly grew more urgent. Advisors attempted to coordinate alternative arrangements. Secondary venues were contacted, new dates proposed. Even unconventional strategies, private events, smaller engagements, intimate gatherings, were considered in the hope of salvaging momentum. But with each outreach, the pattern remained: hesitation, deferral, or refusal. It's here that the psychological aspect becomes critical. The staff were not just negotiating logistics. They were negotiating perception. Every no, every silence, every delay wasn't just a practical obstacle. It was a symbolic one. The repeated inability to secure affirmation from high-profile venues was an early indicator that the public and corporate appetite for the tour was less enthusiastic than originally assumed. According to insiders, tension in these emergency calls sometimes spilled into subtle arguments. Not explosive confrontations, but sharp exchanges of opinion. Some team members reportedly pushed for a hardline approach, make demands, assert influence, enforce status. Others advocated for caution, minimize exposure, scale back, avoid making the absence of venues public. The debate reflects a broader organizational dilemma. How do you maintain brand prestige in the face of collective hesitation? And that is where emotion begins to intersect with strategy. Sources describe a pivotal moment in one particular emergency call. A senior member of Archewell's executive team reportedly outlined the full scope of the problem: multiple venues, repeated refusals, and a growing sense of apathy. The tone reportedly shifted from urgent problem-solving to grim acknowledgement. Words like unavoidable, strategic pause, and reassessment were reportedly used. Even in the most professional, careful phrasing, the implication was clear: the tour was in serious jeopardy. It was at this point, insiders say, that the CEO's role became central. Tasked with communicating the reality to Meghan Markle, the CEO reportedly delivered a message that was diplomatic, precise, but unavoidable. The Australian tour could not proceed as planned. There was no immediate alternative that preserved the intended scale or symbolic significance. The confirmation, though carefully worded, was a psychological blow. This was more than a setback. According to insiders, it was a moment of reckoning. The team, despite weeks of preparation and optimism, had reached a point where hope could not be manufactured. The silence and refusals were not anomalies. They were a reflection of broader sentiment. And yet, the story does not end with acknowledgement. It escalates. The CEO's confirmation reportedly triggered an emotional reaction. Frustration, disbelief, and tension reportedly surged behind closed doors. Meghan Markle, according to multiple sources, was deeply disappointed. This was not merely about logistics. It was about what the cancellations symbolized: a challenge to influence, a resistance to prestige, and a questioning of relevance. Within the internal conversations, strategic options were debated: scaling back, rescheduling, reframing the narrative. But each potential solution carried risk. To scale back was to signal retreat. To cancel outright was to admit defeat. To push forward against hesitation was to risk public refusal or embarrassment. The emergency calls, while outwardly calm, were charged with these implications. Staff and executives had to navigate between reality and perception, emotion and optics, hope and acknowledgement. And here's the critical insight: the internal chaos mirrored the external silence. The lack of response from venues amplified internal stress. The cumulative effect of repeated refusals and unreturned inquiries created a sense of inevitability that was psychologically destabilizing. It is in this environment that decisions began to solidify. The notion of the tour as a triumph was replaced by its necessity as a test of resolve, reputation, and adaptability. And, according to insiders, the realization that the tour might not succeed as originally envisioned changed the tone of every subsequent planning conversation. But even as internal tension mounted, there was one fact that could not be ignored: the public was watching, and perception is reality. Any misstep, any visible hesitation, any leak about cancellations could amplify scrutiny and criticism. The balance between internal emotion and public-facing messaging became delicate and precarious. And then came the next, defining moment. According to multiple accounts, a critical decision point emerged. Would Archewell announce the cancellation quietly? Attempt to salvage it through a smaller-scale plan? Or push for one final, high-profile confirmation of interest, knowing the risk of visible rejection? That decision would set the tone for the fallout. And insiders suggest it was at this juncture that emotion and strategy collided most starkly. Because by the end of these emergency calls, the problem was no longer logistical. It was structural, cultural, psychological, and deeply personal. And what happened next would expose not only organizational limits, but also the emotional intensity at the heart of this narrative. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. According to insiders, those words, or something very close to them, echoed quietly but forcefully through the executive team at Archewell. Until that moment, the idea of hope had lingered. Contingency plans, alternative dates, smaller venues. Each was a thread holding the illusion of possibility together. But when the CEO reportedly delivered the formal confirmation that the Australian tour could not proceed as planned, the fragile network of optimism collapsed. It is important to understand that this confirmation wasn't dramatic. There was no press conference, no public statement, no media announcement. It was internal, carefully phrased, diplomatic, measured. But the impact, according to sources, was immediate and profound. The words were framed with precision. Logistical challenges, scheduling conflicts, strategic reassessment. Each term was chosen to soften the blow, maintain control, and preserve appearances. To the outside observer, these phrases might read as routine. But insiders stressed that this was a carefully coded message. The tour, in its intended form, was no longer feasible. And for a brand whose currency depends on perception, feasibility isn't everything. Prestige, relevance, and audience reception are equally critical. From the CEO's perspective, the communication was clear. The tour could not continue as planned. Yet this clarity did not resolve the underlying tension, it amplified it. Because while the logistical explanation sufficed on paper, it failed to address the emotional stakes. For Meghan Markle, this wasn't merely about dates or venues. It was about symbolic significance. Australia wasn't just a destination, it was a statement. A demonstration of continued international relevance, a litmus test for public perception, and a platform to reinforce Archewell's growing influence. The cancellation struck at all three of these objectives simultaneously. Sources suggest that the confirmation triggered a range of emotional responses behind closed doors. Disappointment, frustration, disbelief, and what some insiders describe as quiet rage. This is the phase where emotion and strategy began to intersect in tense and unpredictable ways. What made the situation especially volatile was timing. According to reports, the confirmation arrived after weeks of mounting tension, repeated silences, and escalating attempts to secure commitments from venues. By this point, the team had been operating under the strain of uncertainty for days, even weeks. The cumulative effect, insiders say, was a sense of inevitability that was difficult to absorb and even harder to act upon. And it wasn't just internal. The ripple effects of this confirmation extended outward, creating potential complications across multiple fronts. Media outlets were already aware that a tour was being planned. The silence of venues had been noticed by journalists and social commentators. Leaks, subtle hints, and speculation were inevitable. How Archewell handled the announcement could either mitigate or magnify scrutiny. At the core of the issue was control, or the loss thereof. For public figures accustomed to commanding attention, maintaining narrative control is crucial. But the tour's cancellation threatened that control. It suggested vulnerability, uncertainty, and the reality that influence, no matter how meticulously cultivated, is contingent. Sources indicate that once the confirmation was delivered, discussions inside Archewell shifted from logistical problem-solving to strategic damage control. Questions emerged. How do we frame this to the public? How do we prevent speculation from dominating headlines? How do we maintain prestige when the tour, the centerpiece of a major initiative, is canceled? These are not trivial concerns. In public relations, timing, framing, and language can define the difference between a managed setback and a reputational crisis. And according to insiders, Archewell understood that any visible misstep could cascade, influencing partnerships, audience perception, and long-term brand credibility. The stakes were high, but the emotional component was higher. According to multiple accounts, Meghan Markle reportedly felt that the cancellation was more than procedural, it was personal. This is where frustration reportedly intensified, compounded by the perception that the silence and refusals from venues weren't simply logistical hurdles, but signs of waning enthusiasm, or worse, deliberate resistance. Internal discussions reportedly included arguments over tone, messaging, and next steps. Some advisors advocated for quiet withdrawal, emphasizing discretion and control. Others proposed proactive narrative management, crafting messages to preempt media interpretation. The tension between these approaches highlighted a key dilemma. How do you maintain authority and influence when key stakeholders are reluctant to participate? Adding complexity was the broader context. Australia's cultural shift, as discussed in Chapter 3, indicated that public and institutional enthusiasm could no longer be assumed. Even venues willing to participate were cautious, calculating potential risk versus benefit. In this environment, attempting to proceed as originally planned risked visible rejection, public scrutiny, or reputational damage. So, when the CEO's confirmation landed, it did more than cancel a tour. It crystallized a pattern that had been emerging for weeks. Logistical obstacles, venue hesitations, and cultural fatigue coalesced into an unavoidable truth. The tour, as envisioned, could not proceed. The psychological impact of this realization was significant. For a team invested in meticulous planning and positive optics, the acknowledgement of failure is destabilizing. For a public figure accustomed to influence and attention, it is deeply personal. According to sources, the immediate aftermath involved both strategic recalibration and emotional processing, a mix of professional urgency and private frustration. And then, as is often the case with high-stakes endeavors, internal focus turned to contingency. What could be salvaged? Could the tour be restructured? Could smaller events or low-profile appearances achieve some of the original goals? Could messaging be adjusted to minimize damage while preserving prestige? The answers, insiders suggest, were limited. Scaling down or reframing would necessarily signal a retreat, a narrative outcome that was incompatible with the intended symbolism of the tour. Yet moving forward without commitment risked further refusals and visible embarrassment. At this point, frustration reportedly reached a peak. This is where emotion met strategy head-on. According to multiple accounts, Meghan's reaction, though private, was intense, characterized by disbelief, agitation, and an insistence on exploring every remaining avenue. The staff, meanwhile, were balancing loyalty, pragmatism, and the realization that some obstacles could not be overcome by effort alone. The confirmation, in effect, marked a turning point. Up until this moment, hope had persisted. Plans, though strained, could theoretically have been executed. But the CEO's confirmation transformed speculation into certainty. It validated the warnings, confirmed the resistance, and made further hesitation untenable. And yet, as insiders emphasize, the confirmation also set the stage for the next chapter in this story, the emotional fallout. Because once reality was articulated, there was no longer a buffer, no ambiguity, no possibility of partial optimism. The situation demanded an emotional response. What happened next, according to multiple sources, was the beginning of a period described as frustration meeting disbelief. Decisions had to be made, communications had to be drafted, and strategy had to be recalibrated. Every step forward was now weighed against the reality of an international tour that would not take place. And that is where Chapter 6 begins. The point at which the reported emotional intensity becomes central. Frustration evolves into anger. Disappointment sharpens into rage. Not public, but private. Controlled, but powerful. Because sometimes, the most revealing reactions happen behind closed doors, away from cameras, headlines, and social media. And in this case, according to sources, the private reaction would be as significant as the public reality. But what came next would escalate the stakes in ways no one anticipated. The word rage is often overused in media, thrown around to dramatize minor frustrations. But according to multiple insiders familiar with the situation, this was not exaggeration. Behind the closed doors of Archewell, the reaction to the confirmation that the Australian tour was axed was intense, emotional, and deeply personal. To understand the context, consider this. This was not merely a cancelled tour. It was a symbolic blow. A meticulously planned initiative, intended to reinforce relevance, influence, and brand authority, was suddenly impossible to execute. And for someone whose public identity is intimately tied to perception and narrative, the implications were profound. Sources describe a scene of controlled chaos. Emails that had previously been diplomatic suddenly carried sharper phrasing. Meetings, once methodical and strategic, were now laced with tension. Advisors reportedly scrambled to contain both the emotional response and the operational fallout. Conversations oscillated between practical problem-solving and expressions of disbelief. How can this be happening? Why is this happening? What does this mean for everything we've built? One insider explained that Meghan's reaction was a mixture of frustration and incredulity. She reportedly felt blindsided, not by the logistical challenges themselves, but by the broader pattern of resistance and indifference. Every declined venue, every delayed response, every vague communication was interpreted not merely as a practical obstacle, but as a symbolic message. Doors that once opened automatically were now closed, silently, and without explanation. This response is consistent with patterns observers have noted over the years. When faced with perceived slights, Meghan has historically responded with intensity, channeling frustration into action. But in this case, the intensity was internal, confined to private settings. Staff and advisors were witnesses to a heightened emotional state, navigating the fine line between supporting decision-making and managing the impact of visible frustration. And what made this reaction particularly significant, according to sources, was its timing. By the time the CEO confirmed the tour's cancellation, weeks of mounting tension, repeated silences, and subtle rejections had already accumulated. The emotional weight of the moment was compounded by a sense of inevitability, the realization that momentum had been lost, that the plan could not proceed as intended, and that prestige was being challenged. Within these private emergency discussions, the stakes became more than logistical, they were existential for the brand. Archewell's team reportedly debated multiple courses of action, scaling down, postponing, reframing the narrative, or abandoning the tour entirely. Each option carried risk, but the emotional undercurrent made negotiation difficult. According to insiders, the intensity of Meghan's response influenced decision-making, creating pressure to act decisively even in a context of uncertainty. Sources describe how frustration manifested in specific ways. Repeated questioning of advisor strategies, insistence on exploring every possible alternative, and a refusal to accept no as a definitive answer. This emotional insistence reportedly drove the team to examine secondary options that might have been considered too ambitious or impractical under normal circumstances. What's particularly revealing is the way private emotions intersected with public strategy. In high-profile organizations, internal intensity must be contained to prevent public perception from shifting. According to sources, the team worked tirelessly to balance emotional response with operational discipline, drafting communications, vetting messages, and exploring every avenue to preserve appearances. And yet, even with careful planning, the private intensity could not be entirely masked. Insiders note that tension was palpable in every interaction. Advisors reportedly described it as a room charged with frustration and disbelief, where every word and gesture carried weight, and every decision was scrutinized through the lens of potential failure or misstep. It's also important to note that the frustration wasn't simply about the logistics. It was about symbolism. Australia, for many months, had been positioned internally as the tour that would signal momentum, relevance, and continued influence. Its cancellation was, in effect, a challenge to authority, credibility, and public perception. That layered symbolism heightened the emotional stakes. At the same time, sources stressed that the reaction remained private. There were no public outbursts, no confrontations aired in media. The intensity existed behind closed doors, confined to internal communications, strategy meetings, and emergency calls. Yet insiders agree that the emotional component was as influential as any operational consideration, shaping decisions and guiding the response. Advisors reportedly faced the dual challenge of calming internal tension while maintaining strategic control. Every choice required balancing Meghan's desire for assertiveness with the pragmatic need to avoid visible embarrassment. Every recommendation had to navigate the intersection of personal emotion and public optics. And then came the most telling aspect of this private fury: focus. Rather than dissipating, the energy reportedly sharpened attention on solutions. According to multiple accounts, every refusal, every delay, every sign of indifference became a challenge to be addressed, a problem to be solved. Frustration became motivation, and motivation drove rapid operational adjustments, even as options were limited. But there's a key lesson here. Emotional intensity, when combined with limited control, can amplify perceived stakes exponentially. The private reaction inside Archewell exemplified this dynamic. The intensity wasn't for show. It was the natural response to a symbolic, reputational, and operational crisis converging simultaneously. And yet, for all that energy, the reality remained immutable. The tour was cancelled. Venues were unavailable. Cultural and institutional appetite had shifted. And that juxtaposition, high emotion versus immutable reality, created a tension that would define the next phase of this story. As insiders describe it, the private fury marked a turning point. The theoretical problem had become real, unavoidable, and deeply personal. Staff had to navigate both practical logistics and the charged emotional atmosphere, making the environment unusually volatile, even for a high-profile organization accustomed to crisis management. And here's the cliffhanger that ends this chapter. While the tour was officially canceled, the private reaction, intense, emotional, and strategic, was only the beginning. According to sources, the aftermath would ripple beyond logistics, shaping internal strategy, public messaging, and even future opportunities in ways no one could predict. The cancellation of the Australian tour didn't just affect scheduling or logistics. According to multiple insiders, it created a ripple effect across the network of partnerships, allies, and institutions that Archewell had cultivated. This is where the story expands beyond the walls of Archewell, revealing how one canceled initiative can trigger a cascade of complications. To understand the scale, consider the careful planning that had gone into the tour. High-profile venues, luxury hotels, charitable organizations, media partners, all were briefed, approached, and courted. Each was selected not just for operational suitability, but for symbolic resonance. Their participation would signal legitimacy, support, and influence. When the CEO confirmed that the tour could not proceed, those connections faced immediate uncertainty. Insiders describe a flurry of calls, emails, and clarifications. Partners who had tentatively committed sought reassurance.